All right, let's now settle in for a few minutes with Virgil's Aeneid. We will ask that you have a copy of Aeneid in front of you. One of the first things that we want to point out for your notes, and I'm assuming that you do have notes in front of you over Aeneid, Aeneid 1, and possibly Aeneid 2, but for sure Aeneid 1. We want to begin by making some quick observations about issues of translation. And I want to begin by making some general observations about the Aeneid, and then you'll want to be in your volume, the Dickinson translation, on page 1. To begin, and now just some introductory comments on the Aeneid. We do a tremendous injustice in this class when we give so little time to so many texts. It's interesting because for a lot of the history of Europe, the single greatest text that we will study for our entire year together will be this text. No kidding. In fact, one of the strange kind of ways I can prove this is when you went into the cathedrals of Europe for a long time, and you went up to the pulpit, there were two books that would sit on that pulpit. The first would be a Bible, of course, and the second would be Virgil's Aeneid. In Christian churches all over Europe. No kidding. Now the reason for that is that Virgil had made a reference in the time in which he was writing to a virgin birth that might occur, and Christians interpreted then Virgil's anticipations of the rise of Christianity, and so Christians themselves began to use the Aeneid in the same way that they often would use biblical text. So much so that they would do this weird thing that if you had a question, by the way, I can recommend that you try this with any of the texts we study, but the Aeneid is one of those really interesting ones, where you actually come up with a question about life or whatever, and then you just open randomly to a page in the book and start reading immediately. For those of you that don't know, this is a very ancient tradition in biblical study. You did this all, the Bible was considered to be a very kind of mystical text. And, should I go out with the girl or the guy or whatever was not an insignificant question in the world of medieval Christianity, for example. And you could just open and start reading immediately where your eyes fell, and the answer would be there within 10 lines. Now, of course, let's point out something. That if you're doing this thing called connecting new ideas to old ideas, you can always find a way to take some lines and kind of start to spin them in such a way that an answer is provided. They actually did this from the pulpit with this volume, the Aeneid. Now, why is that? Well, let's give some observations real quickly. The Aeneid is one of the classic political texts of all time. And here's why. The Romans had a problem. It was a two-part problem. One, they were the greatest civilization in the history of the world. Now, while that's open to debate, and obviously if you had brought in some Assyrians from a time machine, they might have had something to say, or even the Hittites for that matter. Certainly the Egyptians would have had something to say about it. Of course, the Greeks who had been conquered by the Romans would have something to say about it. But be that as it may, in the time that Virgil is living, there is no greater civilization than the civilization of Rome. That's the first part of the problem. That's not really a problem, though. That's kind of a good thing. The second part of the problem, though, is a really intriguing problem. When the Romans conquered people, and they were BAD bad, one of the first questions that was always asked was, where do you people come from? Well, the answer, of course, would be, later we would call it Italy, that piece of land that looks kind of like a shoe or a boot. But the real question was, no, I don't mean what geographically, where do you come from, but your people. Where do you originate from? What is the history of your people? In other words, they needed a Plymouth Rock story. If you're Americans, you know that Plymouth Rock, of course, is one of those famous stories in history about, of course, Europeans landing, etc., the English landing, etc. You have a beginning story, if you will, a cultural cosmogonic story. Origins. Where do you come from? For the Romans, this was a serious problem, because the stories that had been told were kind of like two twins, and one of them gets raised by wolves, and then they drink from the mother she-wolf milk, and this is how, this was the best they could come up with for a story. Now, of course, the real truth is that the people that ultimately became Romans were really kind of a hodgepodge of a whole bunch of different people who had lived in this region that ultimately we call Rome for a really long time. And, it took a long time for them to become the greatest civilization in the history of the world, and maybe the greatest soccer power in the history of the world, depending on who you talk with. When you talk with Italians, they will always say that. But that was not the good enough answer in Virgil's day. So are you ready for this? Virgil invents a Plymouth Rock story. That's what he does. He literally sits down and he says, anything Homer can do, I can do better, because Homer was Greek and I'm Roman. And since I'm Roman, I ought to be able to do it better than anybody else. So he's going to tell the story of where the Roman people came from, and the way he's going to do it is to rewrite history. More particularly, the most famous war in prehistory, and that was, of course, the war at the city of Troy. Okay? Now, when the Greeks tell the story of Troy, there is no Troy left. The walls are all torn down. The body of the small son of Hector is thrown from those walls. Everybody is led away in captivity. And that's the end of it. That's the end of Troy, and that's the end of the story of Troy for the Greeks. Why? Because the Greeks are the ones writing the history. We should point out a political observation here. Usually it's winners that write history. Right? It's winners. It's the people who win the battles who end up writing the histories. CNN wasn't there the afternoon of Wounded Knee. It would only be much later that anybody would actually start doing research to discover how many women and children were shot in the back as they were running away with repeating rifles in the tragedy of Wounded Knee. Okay? The people who won at Wounded Knee, they wrote a history of that. And guess what? It sounded and looked pretty remarkable. Why? Because winners write the histories, not losers. Make sense? So what ends up happening for Virgil is that he makes a decision to write a different history about Troy. While it looked like Troy fell, in the end Troy didn't fall, and here's why. There was actually an embedded Roman there. There was a Roman in Troy. Now he didn't know he was a Roman. He didn't know he was a Roman. He thought he was Trojan, but the gods had other plans, and this is huge. For Virgil, the rise of the greatest civilization, and for Virgil, the Romans were the greatest civilization. For Virgil, the rise of the greatest civilization was defined as destiny by the gods. The gods wanted Rome to run the world. Now, for Virgil, this was self-evident because the Romans did run the world. For those of you, for example, who see the opening sequence of the fight scene, for example, in the film Gladiator, you know that the Romans were able, in terms of their fighting, to pretty much just kick the ever-living snot out of everybody. And until about 410 Common Era, Rome runs the world from about 200 BCE. For about 600 years, these guys are B.A.D. bad. Nobody messes with them, and if they do, they pretty much are just exterminated. Okay? The Romans, however, did really interesting things. They would, for example, go into a place, they would conquer it, and then they would say, we don't want to live here and rule you. We want you to rule yourself. All we want is for you to make sure you pay tribute to Rome. Are you okay with this? And it was amazing. People would go, well, yeah, that's it? Yeah, no, that's it. We don't want to subjugate you other than economically and politically. Everything else you can do exactly the way you were doing it before. And people kind of were like, oh, okay. But the Romans provided a couple of really important things when they did this. Most importantly, they provided their language, the Latin language. They would bring Latin in. And by Latin, then they could disseminate ideas. But Romans were great at taking ideas too. So when they conquer the Greeks, they immediately adopt, for example, all of their gods. The Romans were a very religious people. They have thousands of these gods. They really liked the way that the Greeks had a pantheon of gods as well. So, for example, they named their gods after all their planets. Or, I'm sorry, yeah, right. We understand, right? See how that works? So for example, it's Jupiter, isn't it? And it's Mars, isn't it? See how that works? Okay. So they name their planets after these gods, no doubt. But these gods are all of Greek origin. The other thing that the Romans do is they have great technology. Tremendous technology. There are two things that they learn how to build really well. What are they? What's one? They are tremendous road builders. Now that wouldn't mean a lot to us. That doesn't mean a lot to us when we first start thinking about it. For example, if you've been in the mountains on a really bad dirt road that's really, kind of got really bad ruts and stuff like that, or even so bad that if you're not careful you high center your vehicle, you know all about the importance of roads. What if the road from Worland to Denver was built like that? That was the road you had to drive, which of course at one time in history it was. The road from Worland to Denver was a road like that. If you got high-centered, it was done, right? You had these deep rivets and stuff like that. Well, Romans figured this out. If you can build a good road, then you can move stuff. Two kinds of stuff. Stuff worth money and stuff called troops. And they could move troops a lot faster because they built roads. So for example, they were brilliant at this. They would come in and they would conquer thousands and thousands of miles of a country. And the first thing they would do is build these solid roads. Two reasons for that. If there was an uprising, they could bring troops in really fast. They could get troops all the way from Rome down to Palestine, for example, when Jerusalem started acting up in AD 70, pretty quick. They could get thousands of guys. Why? They had good roads. But then the second thing about roads is that you can take stuff out. So for example, you can go in, you can get a bunch of stuff from the country, you can put it on those roads and you can get it out really fast. Of course, not only did they build roads on land, they were really good at building roads on sea. Now I'm talking about they were great shipbuilders. They figured out how to build ships and how to sail those ships. They learned from people like the Phoenicians and others how to do this. And this helped them to conquer the world. Okay? So they could both conquer the world and then they could hold on to the world. But they didn't have a story of their origins. For Virgil, this was embarrassing. So he sits down and he writes what is really maybe one of the greatest single inventions in the history of literature. He writes the Aeneid. It's a three-part story. Part one tells of the great hero Aeneas in Troy and his escape. Part two, he escapes to North Africa, to a place called Carthage. And for those of you that know your history of Rome, you know that North Africa was always a thorn in the side of the Romans, right? They always were fighting, and you've probably heard of a cat named Hannibal who ended up almost destroying all of Rome. Rome is a city that's almost destroyed a bunch of times. A lot of good luck seemed to kind of be on the Roman side at times. So he goes down to Carthage, where he falls in love. This is going to be a love story. Some argue one of the greatest love stories of all time with Dido. And Dido is going to be a kind of motif, a figure for us, a woman who is jilted, what we will call the jilted lover. She basically listens to Aeneas' words. He is a great speaker. And he talks her into sleeping with him before she marries him on the promise that he can become the king of all of North Africa. He's going to do it, interestingly enough. He's actually going to do it. There seems to be reason to believe he's actually in love with Dido and he doesn't just want her stuff, her kingdom. And so he promises to wed her, but on the night before he's to get married, the God comes and speaks to him, the messenger God. And he says, dude, what are you doing? You are not born to marry Dido and to be a king down in North Africa. You are rather born for a different destiny. And that's going to be one of the key themes throughout this entire poem, is this notion of destiny. You are born. Certain men are born for certain kinds of destinies. And this, in other words, isn't about Aeneas at all. It's about a great people. So you have the third part, Aeneas, in what today we call Italy. And it's basically a story of intense war. If you sit down and just read the Aeneid from front to back, you are going to inevitably be blown away by the violence of this text. You can't believe that descriptions of blood coming out of the human body could be told in so many different ways, in the most graphic of ways. I mean, I've had students before who took me at my word here, sat down and read this thing, and then they were like, whoa, you weren't kidding. It's like intense description of what it looks like when the head is severed from the body, and how veins are coming up through the open trunk of the neck, and blood is spurting out, and what the arm or a severed trunk looks like on the ground, writhing around in the dirt. I mean, it's intense detail. Why would Virgil do this? Because he's writing a poem for a people who love to watch gladiators fight to the death. They love it. They love blood sport. They love it. All of them. Their men, their women, their children all love it. There is no violent film that you can imagine that the West has created today that comes anything close to what they watched in the Colosseum for fun. And they took their children to see this so that they could educate their children. One of the reasons why Romans said that when we get in war, our children never run is because by the time they get ready to fight, they've already seen thousands of people die. Many times they've seen people begging for their lives and then body parts lopped off. They've seen it over and over again. We would today call it desensitized. They're desensitized to this kind of thing. Why? Because those people who are dying deserve to die. Why? Because they're not Romans. It was that simple. It was that simple. If you're not a Roman, you deserve to die. And if you don't show proper respect to Romans, you definitely deserve to die. And that's just kind of the way they lived. But what gives them this right? Well, Virgil writes a poem that says, I'll tell you why you got the right. The reason you got the right is because you're Romans, and Romans are very particularly special kinds of people. Well, with that as our introduction, let's now turn to the opening lines of the Aeneid. And we will see, as we have seen in all of these epics that we've been working with preceding, that there's such important work that's being done in the opening lines of this poem as well. Let's take a look at it together. I'll be working with the Dickinson translation. I'll also provide you with the Rhodes translation, R-H-O-A-D-E-S. And I'll kind of just spend my time with those two translations. Let's take a look. I'll start with yours, Dickinson, Book 1. Of arms I sing, and the hero, destiny's exile, who came from the beach of Troy and was the first to make the Lavinian landfall, Italy, who in the grip of immortal powers was pounded by land and sea to sate the implacable hatred of Juno, who suffered bitterly in his battles as he strove for the sight of his city and safe harboring. For his gods in Latium, himself the founder of his race, of the Alban chiefs of the towers of Rome. Then Muse, remind us, the invocation of the Muse, remind us of what was the root cause of the goddess's wrath. What had he done that a queen of heaven should break on such wheels of disaster a man so patently pious? Is it a god's nature to nurse an abiding fury? There was an ancient city, a colony of Tyre, which stood on the African coast fronting across the sea. And then he'll begin with this notion of Carthage. I want to point out right away 3 observations from the opening lines of the Aeneid. The Aeneid will be a poem about 3 things. And we see it right in the opening lines. First, it will be a poem about a man. Not just any man. A true hero of a man. See, Virgil has the advantage of the Iliad and the Odyssey. Think about what I just said. Virgil has the advantage of the Iliad and the Odyssey. These are already texts with which he not only is familiar, but he has memorized. Right? Okay. So what does that mean? Well, that means that he can take both of the epic heroes, 3 if you want to consider Hector an epic hero, which obviously Virgil would. So think about that. If you could take Achilles, Hector, and Odysseus, with a little bit of Ajax thrown in, for those of you that have read the Odyssey, you know that he comes up over and over again as a strong and mighty warrior. And you could combine all of those into your mythic ideal hero. That ideal hero would be Aeneas. Let's point out, Aeneas will have all of the greatness of all those other all those other heroes without many of the faults. Okay? So in other words, you have the quintessential superhero. So that many, many years later, when you're looking at comic heroes, comic book heroes, that we today, of course, mostly know of in more film, like Batman and Superman and on it goes. Iron Man, all these kinds of heroes. When you look at all these heroic kinds of characters, right, they all originate in terms of their primary pattern from one hero. Not Achilles, not Odysseus, not Hector or Ajax. The greatest hero in antiquity is Aeneas. He is the West's true superhero. And it doesn't matter. I mean, if you sit down and read all of the Aeneid, and then you start watching and reading comic books and watching everyone, Spider-Man, all of them, they will all track back to this one hero. More than any other, Aeneas is the perfect idealized hero for the Romans, and of course, for the civilizations that would ultimately kind of grow out of Rome, namely Western civilization. So this is going to be a poem about a man. 2, it's going to be a poem about a city. Notice right away that Rome is mentioned. The Romans are deeply patriotic to their city. Of course, it is incumbent on you as young scholars to make a promise to yourself that before you turn 50, you've visited the city of Rome. There are few cities on this planet that you would want to put any higher on your list than this city. It is the great city, but what's important is that it was a great city when Virgil lived in it. It was already spoken of as the greatest city in the history of the world. Not only did they say Rome is the greatest city now, they said Rome is the greatest city of all time. Far superior to that city of Troy. Far superior to the other cities, Jerusalem and other cities. The greatest city is Rome for Roman people. And so this is going to be a poem that constantly is kind of celebrating that. Now let's say it out loud. Unlike the Iliad and the Odyssey, the Aeneid is a patriotic poem. I mean, after a while, you get kind of like numb to the fact that Virgil keeps saying, we're number one, over and over again, right? I mean, think about it this way. Can you go onto the campus of Duke and actually convince anybody there that the North Carolina basketball program is a better program than Duke's program? The answer, by the way, to that is absolutely no way. Why? Because those people are fanatics about what they think basketball should look like. And they just kind of have it all figured out. See, they think that's the way it is. Of course, by the way, the same is true if you go down the road right to Chapel Hill. They have a different view, you see, okay? See how that works? That kind of pride in the institution is embedded in the notion of the Aeneid. And you have to, as an American reader, you have to respect that. Why is it, see, this is a funny question, why is it that Americans think that America is the greatest country in the world? See, that's an interesting question. And of course, cynics will often point out, well, that's just because we've deluded ourselves into believing so. But Americans will often say, well, no, but it's true. All you got to do is go back and look at history. Question, does the First World War get won without Americans? The answer, by the way, is no. Secondly, does the Second World War get won without Americans? The answer, by the way, is no. There's no historian that debates that fact. And you could go on with these kinds of questions, and all of a sudden Americans say, I can give you 100 solid arguments why America's the greatest country in the world. Not least of which, it seems the one country everybody else seems to want to get into. And it's probably in part because we have Walmart, but it's a few other things as well. You see how that works, right? That notion of patriotism, let's say it out loud, the Romans didn't invent it, they just perfected it. The Romans perfected this notion. The Greeks were highly as well patriotic. But they were kind of a group of people that lived in all different parts of the Aegean, and they were kind of like collectively known as Greece. And of course they had their famous city of Athens. But they had lots of other famous cities as well, Thebes and other kinds of cities like that. But Romans had Rome, and there was no second Rome. There was the city of seven hills, and that was the city. And even today when you visit Rome, you cannot be helped but blown away by some of the structures that Virgil and his pals walk past all the time. Some of those unbelievable structures are still standing. Many of them, of course, are in decay and dilapidated now. But this is going to be a poem about celebration of a city. We're number one, which leads to the third thing this poem is a poem about, and it's about a people. It's not just about a city, but it's about a people. And what's interesting is that you almost cannot differentiate in this poem between the people of Rome and Romans. Do you know what I mean? It's like one in the same. They're symbiotic. Notice how that's different, for example, from Americans. Now, granted, New Yorkers often think that New York is America. But anybody outside of New York will oftentimes say, well, yeah, but come on, there's a lot more to America than New York City. The Romans didn't think that way. You could, for example, be in an outpost way out in the middle of old Britain, and you still thought of Rome as being Roman. That's what you were. You were a citizen of that city, and by virtue of being a citizen of that city, you were a citizen that we call Romans. So this is going to be a poem not only about a city, but about a people. What kind of people? Well, not surprisingly, this people kind of look like their founder, Aeneid. They kind of think about themselves that way. So let's go back. So you can put all three of these together. Aeneid represents everything that's great about a city and about a people. And to that degree, alone, we could argue, this poem is worthy of study for us. Now, since we're only looking at the first couple of books, again, I'll go back to what I said at the top of my lecture. This is painfully tragic that we don't give ourselves an entire month to just read nice and slow through this poem and begin to kind of work through it. But I'll tell you in advance that if you sit down to actually read this poem in its entirety, you grow quickly bored because it is so unbelievably repetitive. It is a very repetitive poem. In that regards, it looks very much like the Iliad, a song of war that's very linear. Okay? It's very repetitive. In what regards is it repetitive? You have a hero. He goes into a terrible situation. He has to problem solve to get out of it, and he gets out of it. He goes, hurrah, and then he falls into another problem. And then he has to solve it, and then he gets out of it, and then he goes, hurrah, and then he has to fall into... Wait a minute, that sounds like a lot of movies we're familiar with, even epic films, like, of course, the great collection of 3 stories that Tolkien will write, that Pete Jackson made famous, of course, in his, famous movies, right? Lord of the Rings. If you'll think about it, we just reduced Lord of the Rings down to a simple storyline. A hero goes through a lot of bad stuff, gets out of it, goes hurrah, some nice music plays, and then it starts all over again. And over, and over. To that degree, it can be kind of repetitive and boring. Let's point out, though, that's how Romans saw life. They saw life as a constant struggle against a series of adversaries, moments of suffering, pain. Let's go back now to the poem itself, the opening lines. Of arms I sing, and the hero. Now, the more ancient or older translation of this is to say, of arms I sing and of the man. Arms and the man becomes a very famous play. What do we mean by arms, though? Let's put it in our notes. Wait, arms? Is that what we mean? Weapons. Weapons. That's what we mean by arms. This is going to be a poem of warfare. Are you ready for this? Violent video games are born here. Batson says yes. Violent video games are born here. The notion that it's fun to watch people get jacked up, born here. That's where this poem is headed, okay, for us right away. Arms and the man. Violence and the hero. Destiny's exile. Let's point out, this is a poem about an exile, a drifter, a guy who is dislocated from the country that he belongs to. And in that process of being dislocated, he is fulfilling his destiny. In other words, are you ready for this? He has no choice in the matter. This was actually Virgil's answer to why is Rome greater than every other country? Because that's the way the gods wanted it. That's the way the gods wanted it. And by the way, if you go back and read early American thought, as we did last year as juniors, you will time and again hear from pulpit sermons that were written that actually said that America is a city on a hill, a light to the rest of the world. Why? Because that's what God wanted. That was the notion. They, of course, felt very comfortable with this idea because all of those people who came to our eastern seaboard, they knew this poem really well. Aeneas is a guy who has no choice but to be great. The gods made him that way. Look at the next line. Who came from the beach of Troy and was the first to make the Lavinian landfall, Italy. Of course, that's kind of funny to say the first, because when he arrives, there's, guess what? All kinds of people there who he gets to subjugate and smash. It's funny things what a bowler can do to a skull, and of course Virgil's going to describe it in graphic detail, you see. The Romans had all different kind of creative ways to kill somebody and keep them alive for a long time. Of course, we're most familiar in the Christian tradition with their classic little ditty called the crucifix. But they had lots and lots of other ways to kill people. Many of them are going to be outlined in this poem, and every time they're going to be outlined with yay, as they, tell you in graphic detail how the pole went into the body, etc. Who in the grip of immortal powers was pounded by land and sea to sate the implacable hatred of Juno. Who is Juno? Who is Hera? Zeus's wife, backslash, that's it says, sister, it's all a bunch of inbreds, we won't get into that. Sorry. Right, those poor Greeks. The question here is, why would Hera be so mad at Aeneas?
Isn't like Carthage her city or something?
Oh yeah. This has to do with the way... That's right. This has a lot to do with the judgment of Paris. Remember, all the way back, Hera was one of those who was not allowed to take the apple. Who won the apple? Aphrodite did, right? So wounded pride is one thing. She didn't make it as the cover of some magazine. She was slighted, so she was mad about it. But then the other thing is the way that Aeneas will have treated that important woman Dido, and more particularly that city that is such an important city for Juno in Carthage. His disrespect, if you will, is going to lead to her being angry. In what ways is this similar to the Iliad and the Odyssey? Yeah, there's going to be that story of Paris, no doubt. But what about the heroes of the Iliad and the Odyssey? How are they also kind of cursed by the gods? Remember at the opening lines of the Iliad, it was Achilles was kind of doomed by the gods, remember? Zeus. And then the Odyssey as well will have kind of, he seems to be doomed by the gods. The gods seem to be kind of, especially what god is mad at him? Poseidon is mad at him, right?
It's kind of the same way. Poseidon doesn't like Odysseus, but all the other ones are fine with him. And then this one, Hera doesn't like him.
Fascinating,
but
right?
Everybody else.
So you see a pantheon of gods who kind of pick sides, if you will. They kind of at times root for one hero versus hoping for the downfall of another hero. What do you think in antiquity, what do you think they're trying to suggest about the way things work out in terms of your fate? How would you say it, Miss Ramos? Like sometimes the gods want you to be successful, and sometimes the gods don't want you to be successful. How is that a useful kind of theology when something bad happens to you? Think about the last time something really rotten happened to you. You had such high expectations for something to work out, and then it didn't. Whatever that was, whether it was in love, or whether it was in friendship, or whether it was in something else, some kind of social thing or whatever. And it didn't work out for you. And you were like really depressed and sad about that. Dare we say it? You begin to question the meaning of your own existence. That's how upset you were. You were ready to throw in the towel. How does this kind of thing help you get through that moment? So when something really bad happens to you, this seems to suggest what? Blame it on the gods. Absolutely right. Look, this is not my fault in the end. I did what I could. I tried to do the best I could, and then something really bad happened. It's not my fault. Of course, the ultimate loss is the loss of death. Think about how brilliant a construction this is. In the end, the answer to the question, why did she have to die? But that's not fair. Right, but here's the point. Life is not fair. Let's put that in our notes. This is huge to understand. Both the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Aeneid. Life isn't fair, but wait a minute. Virgil's going to say it the other way around. It's the very fact that life isn't fair that makes it fair. Because it's fair for everybody. In other words, everybody gets jacked. It's not like you're somehow specially chosen for pain unless you're Aeneas. Are you ready for this? Aeneas is the hero of our poem. He's especially chosen for pain. What